Hello, everybody, and welcome to Hash Rate. My name is Mark Jeffrey, and my guest today is Mark Pesce. So we were kind of metaverse enemies in the late 90s. Now we're like metaverse frenemies, I guess. The metaverse enemy of my frenemy is my frenemy or something. So anyway, we've been pals for about 30-some-odd years, and now we're sort of covering the crypto space together. So tell us about your podcast before we move any further.
Well, which one?
Yeah, I mean, you've got many.
There's two of them. So there's The Next Billion Seconds, which I've been doing for 6 years now, and we just finished a series called A Brief History of the Metaverse, which, in fact, you're a part of, because you are a part of the history of the Metaverse. I did that with Tony Parisi, who I know has been on Hash Rate.
Yes, we did have Tony on.
And, of course, I did a lot of my work 30 years ago with Tony to create the first versions of the Metaverse, VRML, all that stuff. It's a lot of fun. I would think that people listen to it. We basically did it as a series of radio plays, so it's not just two blokes around a microphone. Oh, I'm sorry, like this. But it's actually quite fun. And, of course, you acted a couple of the parts for us, which was also fantastic.
I did. Well, you gave me a great script, so, and dude, the production value of that whole thing, it was very choice. It was very NPR.
Yeah.
So it was super impressive.
We broke the entire production staff, and I'm secretly proud and also ashamed in that way that you are when you've broken a production staff because you worked them so hard.
Yeah, well, the end result, it was undeniably awesome. So congratulations, and thank you for making me a part of it.
Thank you.
So most recently, the reason why you're on this show is, first of all, you've become somewhat of a crypto expert yourself over these last few years. Yeah, you have. But more interestingly,
I can't say that when I'm on camera with you, Mark. I mean, maybe to normal people, sure, but to you, no. Let's just be clear.
So anyway, but you operate in a very different slice of the crypto universe than I do, or even most people.
Yeah.
So, and you recently were at. Actually, I'm just going to let you introduce your interactions with this slice of the world because you'll characterize it far better than I would. So, tell us about it.
I'll give you the potted history. All right, and we'll start to mention, there's a bunch of acronyms in this soup, but the first acronym I'll mention is the Financial Activities Task Force, or the FATF, or as we like to call them, the FATF. They don't like to be called the FATF. They like to be called the FATF. Now, most of us have not heard of the FATF. It is, I like to characterize them, and I know they really won't like this, as the Illuminati of the financial system, because they're shadowy, they're behind the scenes, and they actually do pull all the strings. What they are is they're a body that was chartered by the G20 at the beginning, I think this was in the late 1980s, to handle some of the issues around money laundering and bank transparency. And I'm pretty sure they were the reason that the Swiss suddenly decided that their banks were going to play. All right, because you remember the Swiss had basically resisted international banking legislation, and then all of a sudden they caved. I don't know for sure, but I'm pretty sure that the FATF was the instrument for that. Then you get a little bit further along, and 9/11 happens. And part of what the FATF is charged with is making sure that there's strong laws for counterterrorism financing, CTF, and anti-money laundering. Okay, so that when you move money, particularly across SWIFT, but any amount of money, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction how much money is involved, but it's almost always at least, it's almost always $5,000 or less, very rarely above $5,000. When you move that amount of money across a jurisdictional border, a national border, you have to record information about the party sending and the party receiving. And the banks on both sides are required to do KYC, know your customer. All right, so they're required to know that these entities are verified by them and that these entities do not exist on any do not send money to lists, right?
Right.
So this was because when they took a look at the money trails post 9/11, they understood that these services were being used to funnel money to fund terrorist operations. All right, so that was the priority of the FATF, and they had been doing that. Now, I have
a quick question before you move on.
Yeah.
So FATF, I'm just going to call them FATF. So I know that they're an international body, and I know that they're responsible for making sure that all the banks coordinate on, in the fashion you just described. Right. Do they have any real power?
So this is exactly what I was going to touch on, because let me explain to you how this works in practice. Because the only thing that the FATF can do is it can make recommendations. All right, so it's got it's a body, it's a working group. There are 39 member countries, and then around 160 countries that are affiliated through those member countries. And the member delegates from the member countries come together, I think, 4 times a year, and they debate the process and the recommendations. When those recommendations are made, the 39 member countries have agreed to implement FATF recommendations within a reasonable period of time. Those 39 countries are reviewed on a 5-year period about their compliance with those recommendations. Now, in practice, what this means is that because it is not an international regulatory body, because we really don't have those, right? What it means is those recommendations are then handed off to, it might be, I think it's FinTrack in America, and I know it's FinTrack in Canada. It's, I forget what the tracking body is in America. It's OzTrack here. There's a bunch of them that do this kind of work. And that then it has to work its way into either regulation or legislation in each of those 39 jurisdictions. So it becomes law, right? It becomes law and it becomes practice. And then it's up to the various banks and payment systems to work out what that actually means in practice. So every 5 years, the FATF goes around and checks in on each of those jurisdictions for their compliance with those recommendations. And there's a long list of them, and you'll get a check or you'll get a minus. And if there are a sufficient number of minuses on your report card, you will end up on what they call the gray list. All right? No one wants to be on the gray list because that means that they're going to be keeping an eye on you. And if within I assume it's a negotiated period of time, but it's not forever. It's going to be sort of a year or two. You haven't remediated enough of those minuses on your gray list, you go on the blacklist.
And that's like North Korea and stuff like that, right? That's
and Iran and I don't think Cuba's on it. But essentially what that means is you are now denied access to any of the payment systems, networks, and banks, because any bank that trades with anyone or any nation on the blacklist goes on the blacklist. Right? I mean, this is where you run. Effectively, what you do is you violate your national law, right? You violate your money laundering laws.
Right.
Okay?
So you don't want to get on this list because you'll get disconnected from SWIFT, basically, ultimately.
Well, I mean, I think a disconnection from SWIFT, I think, is the first order, right? I think it's also anyone who touches your banking system in any way faces jurisdictional enforcement within their jurisdiction. Right? So SWIFT is the tip of the iceberg, but essentially everything connected with that country in terms of its finance is radioactive. So to touch it in any way means you become radioactive, and then your local regulators will come and quarantine you and probably fine you and possibly jail you. And when you hang out with international bankers, as I did for a few years, because my entry point into all of this was to do a bunch of work with SWIFT back in the early 2010s. When you get international bankers together, they do not talk about interest rates. They don't talk about financial instruments. They talk about compliance with these laws, because these are the only things that will regularly send bankers to jail.
Wow.
Right? So you get their attention. All right. So that is what the FATF does, or at least has done in the past. Now let's come to the present moment, because that sort of explains, and you can see why I'm calling them the Illuminati, because they really are behind the scenes. Right? It's not them. They're putting whispers into the right ears, and then all sorts of things happen. All right. In 2014, which is, we look at historically, when did Cyprus announce its haircut? It was like 2012, right? Mm-hmm. For all the money that was kept in the Cyprus banks, there was a haircut of, 20 or 30%, and all of a sudden, a lot of money got converted.
Just when you say haircut, Cyprus actually went into people's bank accounts and took money out.
That's what I mean by haircut.
I know. I just want to make sure everybody's following what you mean when you say that, right?
Yes.
So they stole money from their citizens. I mean, there's really no other way to say it.
They did, and so there was, of course, a migration via Bitcoin to repatriate those funds.
Right.
All right. And that happened, I think, in 2012. I can't remember, but I think it was 2012 when it happened.
Yes, people said, I don't want to lose my money. This is garbage.
Yeah.
So I'm getting it out of here, and I'm doing it via Bitcoin because it's the only way to really move it out of the system efficiently.
Yes, exactly. And presumably without attracting the interest of someone who would be trying to take a haircut out of it. So all of those things. I'm pretty sure that at that point, the FATF understood that virtual assets, as they call them, and, we can call them either crypto assets or virtual assets or digital assets, doesn't really matter. But I think they understood that this was something that they needed to attend to. Of course, at that point in time, you were also seeing some financing evading national borders because it was being converted to specifically Bitcoin and being used for that. Silk Road is starting to grow up around this point in time. So there was a cluster of things. But I suspect just in terms of sheer dollar volume, it was Cyprus that was their penny drop moment around this. So by 2014, the FATF now has a working group. And bless them, they spent 5 years studying the problem. They did not act precipitously. They spent 5 years studying the problem, nutting out what they thought a digital asset was. And they're roughly the only international organization that has come to a version that is sensible. Everyone else is a little, all right. They spent a long time on the problem. So in 2019, they published their recommendations for digital virtual assets and the requirements of virtual asset service providers, VASPs, which I'm sure on your show we just call exchanges, right?
It's important because people don't know what VASPs are in my world, right? No, I know because you told me, but other than that,
this is the FATF language here, right? And that language has become used in this context now. We would normally call them exchanges, right? But they're organizations who are dealing in virtual currencies, often as intermediaries, on-ramp
question.
Exchanges.
Would a DeFi protocol be a VASP?
And that is an interesting question, which we will come to further along, because I think that really represents the cutting edge of where thinking is going. But let's not get ahead of ourselves, because
fair enough.
In 2019, although DeFi existed, technically it hadn't really started its inflection into modern use, right? That comes really simultaneous with the pandemic. So it's still about a year in the future. So no one is thinking about it yet. You might have been thinking about it, but again, you're special, right? But certainly no one in that space was thinking about it. So they came down with...
It's only been about 2 years. And if these guys take 5 years to kind of think about things, they're like Ents, right? They're like, we have just agreed that you are not orcs, right? So, and I appreciate that. Like, thank God they're like that, right? They're not hyper reactionary. So 2 years is not a lot of time for them.
No, and look, we will talk about DeFi further in because it merits its own discussion because it opens up a whole bunch of other stuff. So in 2019, in May of 2019, the FATF at their meeting, which I think was in Geneva, they came out with a series of recommendations. All right. And there's recommendation 15 and recommendation 16, which are the key recommendations here. But they also published a great big report where they're like, here's what we think virtual assets are. And they sort of go through it. And it showed the fact that they'd done their homework. All right. And this document, by the way, is freely downloadable. I'm sure that you'll be able to find it and link it to the podcast. It was all out there. But basically, recommendations 15 and 16 said, look, if you're moving virtual assets across a jurisdiction, so from an exchange located in one jurisdiction to an exchange located in another jurisdiction, and the value of those virtual assets is greater than some quantity that the jurisdiction can set for itself, then what they call the travel rule applies. In other words, you have to do KYC on the sender and the recipient, and you have to record that information, and you have to validate that those people are not on naughty lists, and then you can allow that transfer to go forward. So this is what the FATF was about to make a recommendation of. Now, at this point, 2019 was still the golden age. Crypto was effectively unregulated anywhere in 2019, right? And was laboring under the belief that perhaps it would never be regulated because it was somehow different. And so these recommendations landed with a bit of a thud. And this is where I now start to enter this story after all of that preamble.
Right.
In 2019, at the G20 meeting, which was in Osaka, I was asked to chair and to facilitate the Virtual Asset Service Provider Summit, the V20. All right. And so we took over a hotel ballroom in downtown Osaka, and we had about 130 people, including representatives of the large exchanges like Kraken and things like this. And what happened was it was their first chance to front up to, at that time, Tom Nayland, who was the FATF delegate who had been responsible for drafting this legislation and also doing the 5 years of research work, right? And I, sitting here as summit chair, am thinking, oh my God, this is going to be a fist fight. I'm going to stop this person from being slaughtered by all of these very angry crypto companies. To his credit, Tom spent an hour explaining in detail what the FATF is, how it operates, and why it believed these regulations were important. And here's the kicker, because one of the phenomena that all of the exchanges in 2019 had been familiar with was the phenomenon of being debanked, right? Exchanges get debanked all the time. Why? Because a bank cannot work with the party that is not doing its AML and CFT homework, right? Because again, that it's radioactive contagion, right? If that entity, the VASP or exchange, is not doing its homework and then the bank is doing work with the exchange, it is dirty. And so
yeah, the bank can get, I get it. Based on what you told
one part of the bank that wants to make money says, yes, let's do this. And then the risk part of the bank, and risk people are very powerful at banks, comes in and says, what are you thinking? And then basically debanks the exchange. And this had been happening a lot. And Tom's carrot, he's like, yes, okay, there's this regulatory work, but the carrot is, if you do this right, you won't get debanked. Now, I don't think he said that in so many words, but that is essentially the offer, right? If you organizations trying to work with large banks in your respective jurisdictions want to be able to do this, you have to make yourself safe, clean for these jurisdictions. That was when there was a penny drop in the room, and it became less a conversation about why are they trying to regulate us than how do we do this in a way that causes us minimum harm, minimum work, all the things that people think about once they have accepted the fact that regulation is going to be a reality for them.
Can I stop you for just a second here? Because I got a question about this. So even back then, if you join, and I was very active, right? So I was on many exchanges, and all of them required me to KYC. I had to give them my license, right?
Yes.
They had to make sure it was me, and they did pretty rigorous checking up on their customers. So it wasn't
not all of the exchanges, though, Mark.
Not all of the exchanges. That is true.
All right.
That is true. But most of them, even back then, at least the ones I was on.
The ones that but this is the thing. You were on the bigger exchanges who knew, because the folks, like the head of compliance at Kraken had just been the head of compliance at like Wells Fargo, because I met them, right?
Yeah, I was on Kraken. So that's one of the ones
Yeah. So that's what Kraken understood. That was the level of compliance that they were going to need if they were going to continue to work within a regulated financial system. There are plenty of exchanges out there that were playing absolutely fast and loose, right? We don't hear about them. We wouldn't be working with them, but if we were a Russian oligarch, we probably would know about them.
Right. Was Binance one of those? I was never on Binance, so I don't know.
I honestly don't know.
Was Binance in the room when you did this summit? Do you remember that or not? It sounds like you might not know. FTX?
FTX was not in the room. I don't think FTX was in the room. I can't remember whether Binance was in the room. And it's funny because
I'm just curious.
Because the other folks, the folks who are organizing V20 know all of this. They know who was in the room in 2019 and who was in the room in 2020. And it's a different population between the 2 years. So they know. I didn't track that because it wasn't my responsibility to sort of be across that in a way. My responsibility is to make sure that civil conversation happened, but also, and now let me sort of step back into the event, because what happened was for the next day and a half of the event, and the core process of V20 is to get the exchanges to sit down privately. So there's a public session, which is where we hear from regulators about what they think their needs are, and there's a lot of Q&A, and it can get quite detailed. And then the exchanges actually go into private session and they workshop solutions. All right. And then we come back into public session with the regulator and say, so here's what we propose as a solution to the regulations or to the recommendations that you're offering. See, the idea is it's very outcome focused, right? That it's not a talk fest. It's like actually we sit down and we have a whole workshop format where we break down into a number of working groups, and each working group then presents proposals to the group at large before it's in open session. And proposals are either accepted by consensus or they're abandoned because there's no consensus on them. And what came out of that was the fact that, yes, we're going to need some sort of common protocol format so that exchanges can exchange this data in a way that they can understand, because both parties to a transfer have to keep data on both parties, right?
Right.
So that's the regulatory requirement. So that means there just has to be a standard, and that standard was then worked on after the meeting. And it became,
so just to be clear, it's KYC information, right? So if I was on Kraken and I sent money from Kraken to Binance, then my KYC information, which I've gone through with Kraken, had to somehow be transmitted to Binance if I sent money to Binance. That's what you're saying.
Well, it's your identifying customer information. Hopefully the minimum amount required for compliance, but that's always, and that's all. And this is an interesting point that we came to in 2022 that we didn't really understand in 2019, but also the actual details of the transaction, right? Like how much money was it, right? So it's all, so it's not just the KYC, it's the KYC plus the transaction detail.
Yeah.
Right? Okay. So that was basically the floor for what they were going to have to do. And out of that came, I think about 6 months later, what they call IVMS 01, which was the first protocol. All right. Like here's the things that we agreed to. Here's the formats that we think we should be agreed to. And there are now software packages that an exchange can spin up that will basically automate this. You plug your database, your KYC databases into it, and it just kind of does it all automatically. And you would think that would be an end to it and everyone would be happy. Let us now step forward onto the other side of the pandemic, because we're now in 2022, and I've just come back from Bali, as you pointed out, from the G20 meeting. Now, the G20, or the FATF went to the G20 and said this was a very successful group, the V20. They're doing what we wanted them to. They're making life better and safer. We got a promotion. We became an official G20 meeting. All right. Now, that doesn't mean that we're down at the Leaders Summit. You don't want to be near the Leaders Summit because that's just a security nightmare. All right. But it means that we have all the official G20 branding and blah, 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 blah. So we got that promotion. We're now an official G20 thing, which is lovely. Doesn't mean much, but it's lovely. And again, we're meeting at a nice, large luxury hotel in Bali. And we had a little bit of trouble getting people to come because they didn't quite understand why they should be coming. I do know for a matter of fact that we were deep in conversation with the compliance folks at FTX. All right. And literally 3 days before we have the summit, FTX starts imploding. Right, and Binance offers to buy FTX and then doesn't offer to buy. And then the whole thing just starts unraveling, and it's unraveling in real time during the summit.
Oh my God! Right? I did not realize the timing was like
about
that.
Focusing minds, because there's now two elements in play. So there is the FATF. Now I need to introduce another player because we don't have enough international stuff going on. All right,
please.
There's the Financial Stability Board, or the FSB. They are another arm of the G20, which makes recommendations about the prudential regulation of the banking system. So if folks have heard of Basel I or Basel II or Basel III, so those are recommendations that were proposed after the GFC, right? In order to ensure that banks had sufficient capital requirements to cope with unexpected things. And they've modified these over the years.
Global financial crisis. When you say GFC, you mean 2008, the global financial crisis. Yes.
Yeah, the global financial.
So basically this new thing, this new player, their whole purpose is they want to make sure everybody's got enough money to survive a crisis.
That's one thing. No, the FSB's been around for a while.
Yeah.
That's the thing that people listening to this podcast would probably be most familiar with. If they've heard about the fact that banks have to have certain capital reserve requirements and that they stress test themselves against that. Those are, and again, just like the FATF, these aren't regulations, they're recommendations, which would then get passed on to the SEC, or here would be what's our banking regulator? Whatever our banking, but the banking regulators in the various jurisdictions to then become law. All right, so it's the same kind of deal in terms of operation, but they're focused on the prudential regulation of the banking system. And of course, the thing that they have now come to V20 saying, oh, we have these 9 recommendations, and we look at them, and they're the FATF was extremely clear and explicit. The FSB, and I kind of think it's like daddy and mommy. Like daddy knows exactly what you want. Mommy's more about the vibe, right? And the FSB is very much more about, we want a prudential exchange system. Here's the kinds of things that we think you should be thinking about without being really, really specific. Like you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this.
Right.
They have now come to us as well. So we're now not just working with the follow-on from the FATF, which 3 years later is now no longer is it going to happen. It's okay, we've put the wheels on the cart, we've taken the cart out for a short ride, and the wheels keep on falling off the cart, because during any standards process, that's exactly what's going to happen, right? It isn't until you get solutions out into the field that wait, that part doesn't work, or this part is ambiguous, or in the case of a lot of the exchanges, they're quite cranky because most of them have implemented this, but the jurisdictions themselves haven't. And so the FATF is supposed to be sort of waving its naughty finger at the jurisdiction saying, you need to pass laws so that your exchanges are doing this. They're ready. They've done the work. And so there were some...
So the exchanges are complying with laws that don't yet exist.
They're prepared. And they're probably already doing the work. But in a lot of cases, they're like, why did we do this work? Right?
Okay.
Because they expected that the jurisdictions would have regulations in place by now. And I think at one level, they probably overestimated the speed at which these things would become regulations, right? Which is just governments are slow. But at another level, it's also a critique on the FATF saying, do these things right away, which they did without really factoring in what they call the sunrise problem, which is that in order for this to work, all parties have to have it implemented. If it's implemented in a patchwork, it kind of falls apart and it's subject to arbitrage, because people will then choose the jurisdictions or organizations that haven't implemented yet to do their dirty work, right?
Yep, got it.
So all of that is surfacing in Bali and comes out in the public discussions with the regulator. And so there's pressure on the FATF to put pressure on the jurisdictions to make sure that this passes into law. So that's one half of what we're doing this year at the V20. The other half was prudential regulation. And again, because
when you say prudential, what does that mean?
Everything that FTX didn't do. All right. It's like, to put it very simply, it's everything that FTX didn't do, which was custody, taking care that customer deposits were not used. All right. Were not spent. I mean, there's a lot more to it than that, but just start with that, right? That is prudential regulation. Banks are heavily regulated to make sure that they do not get to spend your deposits, right?
Right.
And in return,
in the past, Glass-Steagall.
Yeah. But in return, what do they get? They get insurance from the FDIC, right? This is the give and take here. And so what we're seeing, the thing is that more news is coming out every single day, the lead up to V20 and then during V20. Overnight, like Wednesday, we have the first day, or Tuesday, we have the first day of V20. I go to bed, I wake up in the morning, and BlockFi is collapsing because its assets were in FTT, which they thought was a stablecoin, but turned out, okay. So we're now seeing the phenomenon of contagion. So part of the reason that you have prudential regulation is to prevent widespread financial contagion when there's a collapse, right?
Makes sense.
So what's happening now? So we had 2 workshop groups. One of them worked on the FATF issues. One of them worked on the FSB issues. Yeah. All right. And because we're 3 years in, we're also now considering privacy. How much information do you really have to give when you're talking about something that's covered by the travel rule, right? How can you do it in a way? Can you use a zero knowledge proof so that you can simply say, look, we understand the identity? And And these organizations would not necessarily be across a zero knowledge proof, but that doesn't mean we can't come to them and say, look, there's probably privacy protecting ways to be able to do this. They're open to that discussion. But that discussion is going to have to be led by us because we theoretically are the masters of this. We can prove to them that it will work for them. But none of this we thought about in 2019 because we were just getting started. All of this is on the table now with the FATF. With the FSB, it's going to be about, okay, what does it mean to bring exchanges into prudential regulating frameworks? Now, three of the big exchanges that were there. 4, Wobi, right? Circle, which is a bank as much as anything else, right?
Yeah.
Coinbase, and the other one will come to me, and I forget it right now, but it's another one of the big ones, okay? Oh, OKX. Yep. OKX, sorry.
Yep, OKX, sure.
Right?
Yep.
So every one of those, particularly Circle, because Circle is definitely trying to act like a bank, right? But every one of those exchanges will benefit enormously and are probably in a position for prudential regulation. People can peek at their books and understand that they have enough reserves to be able to cover deposits, all of those things, right? And theoretically, and again, this was floated, a true exchange should be able to put all of that on the blockchain so that it is instantly visible to anyone who wants to inspect it, right? Which is different from how a bank might work in that. So we aren't forgetting that we inherit these other new capabilities. But there was a specific point, which is same risk, same regulation. That was one of the points that the FSB was making. And one of the points of pushback was these aren't exactly the same businesses. They aren't exactly the same techniques. So we want the FSB to have a flexible, similar rather than same approach. Like we're coming back to them saying it's not exactly the same baby or bathwater. I think it's going to take some time and some education to convince them of this. They seem very reasonable, but they also seem like they're very much at the beginning of this journey. But that said, their timing was exquisite. All right, so that's kind of where we are right now.
So you were going into this thing. So first of all, you were going into this conference with Luna sort of in the rearview mirror, but also sort of close.
No,
right?
but
it was only 6 months ago.
Tornadocash was going to be the thing to talk about, to come to DeFi, all right? So let's talk about it. So in 2020, we actually did have the V20 Summit, which was online because pandemic. And we ran it, I think, out of the Paris time zone. And we had, I ran an entire panel on DeFi, and we had some people who were doing DeFi protocols and talking about this. I got to make some closing comments about DeFi. I remember I sent you the video of that after, and I said, look, the more pressure that you put on DeFi, the more it will tend to design itself for pure anonymity, where there is no one at the center, where it's just a protocol. And of course, that's kind of what Tornadocash was, right? And the problem here was that the Americans could see that the North Koreans were using Tornadocash to launder money. They saw it. And they had no one to call to ask them to stop it by design. And that was why they came down like a ton of bricks on anything associated with Tornadocash. It was because DeFi designed in that way, and I had called it. I was like, look, you're going to get forms that are going to be impossible to find any grab-on points to. And that's not really true because, again, you shut down the GitHub, you shut down...
Let's review Tornadocash for just a second. So the guy, I believe it's a guy, who wrote the code for Tornadocash, I forget where he was, not in the United States.
I want to say Switzerland, but I don't know.
Yes, I think it was Switzerland. So they arrested him, and he is currently in jail with no charges because they don't know what to charge him with, but he is still in jail. Right, and they got him like right away. And you could contrast that with Sam Bankman-Fried, who is we're going on like week 3 here. He's the guy stole $10 billion.
Oh,
and
I know.
He's still just sort of walking around. And Maxine Waters is like, can you like maybe come and like testify, please, if it's not too much trouble, sir. Like it's very weird, right?
It is, and the Bahamians are at a loss because. My understanding is the money's not even in the Bahamas. It's over in Barbuda, which is very poorly regulated in this area. So it may very well be that the legal structures there mean that in the acting jurisdiction, no laws have been broken. Now, that doesn't mean you haven't broken United States security laws or Bahamian security laws,
Sure.
but I suspect that the lawyers are trying to sort that out. And I agree with you. I think it is surprising that that anyone connected to FTX is still at liberty. All right.
Right. And also, to be honest with you, the Tornadocash guy, right? And you can say you don't like it, and I totally get. We do not want North Korea, money laundering their stuff easily. Like we all agree with that. Yeah. But the person who wrote it probably did not write it with that intent. They wrote it for privacy. I mean, think very clearly, right? And they, I don't think they broke any recognizable law, which is why they haven't charged them yet.
Yeah. And I think this is why we thought that was going to be the big issue and question, even though in a practical sense, neither the FATF or the FSB really had a look into that. That was purely the Americans and the Department of Justice and whatever bodies are in there effectively going, we've got to stop this at any cost. What's it going to take? And I think that my read of the situation is that that's what happened. It was reactive. I can't tell whether he's in jail because they're trying to make an example or because they don't know what to do with him. I think it's probably something between those two. But again, we came into V20 thinking that was going to be a thing. It never got mentioned, right? It never got mentioned because FTX was literally burning down in front of us.
That is insane. So you probably thought you were going to talk about Luna too, right? I would guess.
I mean, I think, a couple of weeks before Tornadocash, we thought we were going to talk about Luna. And then there's Tornadocash. And that kind of.
Okay, got it.
You see what I'm saying? But again, with Luna has some of the same features of FTX in the sense that its stablecoin collapsed, right? But again, algorithmic stablecoin where FTT wasn't necessarily an algorithmic stablecoin. And again, this is where it
wasn't a stable coin at all. That was an exchange coin.
Oh yeah,
that's an exchange token. Yeah, so it was not a stable coin.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Where the FSB I think is going to be really useful is around establishing. Imagine, if I can posit it, and I'm not speaking for the FSB or for the V20, I'm just speaking for myself here. But imagine a set of guidelines that are similar to the Basel III guidelines around stablecoins. Right? Not the same, but similar. Like, here's how you can test whether your stablecoin will survive a run. Mm-hmm. Right? And here's how you can test whether you have sufficient assets. Because for anyone to buy a stablecoin now is, anyway, that's a whole other episode that we can come back to.
Yeah.
Where I think we have landed though, and I think that the existential.
Tell me where we are today, yes.
Yeah.
And then also tell me what you think is coming, right, based on all this? Yeah.
The existential crisis today is a crisis, hilariously, in trust. In that you don't have to worry about the currency. The currency is trustworthy, but it's the exchanges that have turned out to be the points where trust
the humans in the exchanges, yes. And just to be clear, DeFi worked perfectly through this whole thing. So there was.
Again, Tornadocash that's not perfectly. All right,
it worked perfectly. It didn't fall apart. Yeah, it did what it was supposed to do.
That is not perfectly. And so this is
you can debate whether it should have been made, but it worked perfectly. That was the problem. And let me just be very clear here. When I say DeFi worked, I'm thinking about things like Aave, right? I'm also thinking about things like MIM, Magic Internet Money, which is a DeFi stablecoin protocol, which under extreme stress with both Luna and FTX, continued to perform perfectly. Nobody lost money on MIM. That actually was completely solvent throughout the entire thing.
So, and again, I think this is where the FSB is going to need an interesting education around all of this, right? But the thing is, they're showing that they're educatable. This is the thing, is they came to us and said...
That's surprising. I actually didn't expect you to say that. That's actually very surprising. I mean, I'm very happy to hear that. So.
But the same thing is true with the FATF, right? It's like they know what they need. They're prepared to be flexible about how they get it. And I feel like that's the common ground there, right?
Well, now that you got FTX, has that attitude changed? Are they no more like, okay, enough, and no more Mr. Nice Guy, no more effing around, we got to bring the hammer, we got to bring it fast? Or are they still receptive to suggestions.
So I think that would probably be more of a jurisdictional thing. Like that could be the Americans doing it rather than the FSB. The FSB will probably say, here are our prudential guidelines and here's how we think that they should be implemented in exchanges. All right. And it feels like while that has gained currency, and it was interesting because we had a pre-taped announcement from the head of the FSB who couldn't be there because he was down the street at the leaders meeting. Right, because the head of the FSB gets to go to the leaders meeting. That he pointed to, quote, very recent activities without saying FTX out loud as to some of the reasons for all of this. But we had dialed in from Switzerland, I think, because I think they're based in Zurich, that the head of the part of the FSB who's responsible for this. And you could tell that she was both very thoughtful and very interested in understanding how this will evolve. All right. So where we are now, what's going to happen is on Friday, the 16th of December, the responses will go back to both the FATF and to the FSB from the V20. All right. So these are the responses from the working groups that have been then digested and translated into the kind of language that regulators are familiar with, because one of the biggest things is there's just a complete culture gap between exchanges and regulators, right? That's not true in banking, because in banking, those risk departments are often staffed with former regulators, right? So there's a bridge there. Part of our job now, and part of what we knew we needed to do at this V20, was to start building the bridge with FSB, where we've built the bridge with FATF, right? But now it's building the bridge to FSB. So our responses go back to them, and that now begins the beginning of a dialogue that we hope by around G7, which is going to be May, and then the next G20, which is going to be in Delhi in November, will actually codify into what we think of as going to be a set of recommendations that both parties are in agreement with, right? Like these are the paths forward. All right. Prudential regulation isn't going to happen overnight, right? I mean, just as the same as all the travel rule stuff. It's not going to happen overnight. It's a process. FTX has made it clear to the exchanges that if they don't fall in with that process, no one will want to put money into them. Right? I mean, it's not any more complicated than that, Mark, right? The exchanges, by extension, because FTX has behaved so badly, the exchanges are radioactive, right? Even if they weren't directly touched. But, what did I read this morning is that Gemini is now trying to recover nearly $1 billion from Genesis.
Yes. Yeah. No, so I mean, the Winklevi, I've met them. They're good dudes. They're trustworthy. If I was going to put my Bitcoin into anything, and I did think about doing this, it would have been Gemini Earned, simply because of the Winklevoss and the care with which they have taken with everything. They've gone to extreme lengths to make Gemini very respectable and very legit, right? So more so than most places. So, but look, they basically outsourced their yield to Genesis, who then outsourced it to FTX. So,
and that's what I'm saying. And this is and so with prudential regulation, theoretically, that is not a problem. Theoretically, I mean, even in the banking system, you have collapses, right? You do, right? But there are protections, theoretically, and there's auditing. There's all sorts of stuff that's designed to make that rare rather than common. The problem is this year it has become common rather than rare in exchange space, right?
Right, but even in 2008, like the collapses of all the banks, that was in a highly regulated industry. You still had this contagion and collapse.
But the interesting thing is, but the collapse didn't come from the regulated part, right? It came from the derivatives and the mortgage securities, which were not regulated.
Correct.
Right.
Yes.
So
that's true.
That
is true.
It wasn't consumer deposits. So it wasn't like 1929 where it was literally consumer deposits that were at risk during those bank runs. That was never going to happen. So banks now have prudential regulation around the kinds of things that the kinds of instruments they're allowed to play with. Now to come back to it. So DeFi. To come back to that, this is melting. It's been melting the minds of the FATF. I don't even know if the FSB has crossed the bridge yet, but the FATF is still having its mind somewhat melted by this, right? Because
I'll bet.
Well, because
Yeah.
for all the reasons that we know, it should be having its mind melted. And I'm pretty sure, and I can tell you that one of the things I know that the Australian regulator has looked at was that basically requiring that a DeFi protocol have a director or set of directors, a board of directors, registered to it in order to be able to operate in Australia, right?
So basically centralizing DeFi.
Well, no, just someone to call, because it's not centralizing anything, right? But it's definitely a call list, right? I think that's how they're thinking of it. And it's also, it's centralizing. It's not central. It's locating responsibility, right? I think that's how they're seeing it. So it's not
centralizing responsibility. I mean, the protocol. I mean, implemented purely, a DeFi system should never need a human to ever interact with it ever again.
Right.
Right. So, but and I understand, and the regulators want to say, well, no, we don't like that. Yeah. We want a throat to choke, right? And if there's no throat to choke, then we don't like it. And so,
I think it's more they want someone to call when it seems to be funneling money to North Korea. I think they want someone to call, right? I really do feel as though that's it. Now, I will tell you something. Okay. So we heard from the best presentation was on the first morning. A lovely woman from FinTrack who runs the regulator in Canada, all right, who does all of the financial tracking. She's like, look, I need to put this in very clear terms for you. We had a case where an exchange had found out that a 3-year-old was selling photographs of herself on Instagram. And you know exactly what that means. But she didn't know what she was doing. She knew she was doing it. And she's like, okay, so we blocked that account. 24 hours later, they come back to her and they say, hold the line. Because, in fact, what they'd uncovered was a massive international pedophile and child peddling ring that was using their exchange in order to be able to provide the assets to keep that ring running. And when she landed that in the room, you had to remember that, in fact, we have these laws. Part of it is for the safety of the financial system, but part of it's just for the safety of human beings.
Yeah, right? Sure.
And I think landing that in the room with people who are sort of at the risk level of the exchanges makes the problem quite tangible from the regulators' point of view, that the regulators are trying to make sure that these systems can exist without creating harm. Right? Yep. And that's
totally fair.
And exactly. And if you understand it from that point of view, as much as no one likes being regulated, and no one likes being regulated, right? And the regulators know that. But if you understand it from that point of view, it allows you to have a common framework for a good outcome. And I think that's all V20 wants, right? That's all.
That's very good to hear. So, and look, we all agree North Korea and pedophiles are not good, and we need to guard against them. Yeah. And however we need to do it, like, it's just what we have to do. So, I think everybody's cool with that. I don't think anybody will argue against that.
And DeFi is the moving target, right? And I think when the brains of the FATF have stopped melting, right, they're going to take a look at what it means. And I mean, clearly,
let me ask you a really pointed question, because I want to know the answer to this. So, all these DeFi protocols are permissionless, so any wallet can connect to any exchange, right? And deal in any amount of money as long as there's enough liquidity there. Will we soon be facing a time where, in order to connect to a DeFi protocol, you will have to provide KYC to that DeFi protocol before it will allow your wallet to connect? Okay, what is your gut feel? What do you think?
So one of the proposals I have heard floated, and I don't know if this is going to be an international recommendation or if it will be in specific jurisdictions, is that there will be an expectation that wallets will have some sort of KYC in them, right? Even private wallets will carry some KYC, just so they can provide that KYC when they're asked for it, right? I think that's the way that's going to be thinking. I think with DeFi, I think you're going to see effectively probably two classes of DeFi. One class will be very strict about its compliance with that kind of regulation, and I don't want to call it dark DeFi, but I want to call it a more pure DeFi, which
wild
will
DeFi,
Wild
DeFi.
Well, a more pure DeFi which will rely on the entry and exit points, right? The on-ramps and on-ramps.
The fiat on and off-ramps.
Yeah. The on-ramps and off-ramps of the systems to be able to do its work. And this is what had been mooted by the DeFi panel in 2020, is that that's the way to do it. And whether that's enough of a solution to satisfy the regulators is, again, always going to be an interesting question. So, but I do think that building KYC into DeFi protocols is not, I think most people will not be scared of that, right? Some people will. Some people will
yes and no.
on the grounds that it's not pure enough.
Well, there's also a functional objection to it in that a lot of DeFi protocols stack one on top of the other, sort of under the hood.
Yeah.
So, if all of that stacking requires KYC, that's going to be potentially a problem. So, or maybe not. It'll make the entire thing impossible, possibly.
Well, I mean, and again, I think that that's an interesting question about how that information can flow up and down a stack, right? Because if there are standardized, and again, IVMS provides some data standards around that. If it's a relatively seamless data sharing, right, then it might not be a problem. But you're right. I mean, it's something that deserves careful thought. Or does it really only need to apply at the entry and exit point to the protocol, right, when it's going to some other thing? And this is to
be determined. Yeah.
Well, but I think it's good that we're starting to think in those terms, because it means that there's a possibility to develop or design DeFi protocols for a number of different tastes, right? Like a bank could use a DeFi protocol that had KYC built into it and would be happy to use a DeFi protocol offered by an exchange that had both prudential regulation and this built into their DeFi protocol. So there's going to be certain circumstances where people won't even question, of course we're going to do it this way because we're dealing with some other highly regulated entity that simply insists on it as a requirement.
Well, the other thing is, the more regulated crypto gets, the more big money can flow into it. There's like a shitload of money that is not flowing into it now because it's not regulated and it's not allowed to, right? So
the thing I didn't mention about the FSB, effectively the members of the FSB are the central bank governors of all of the G20. All right. So the FSB is the proxy for the banking systems of the G20. And so this is the final hurdle. If the exchanges can work out what the recommendations from the FSB are that they need to comply with, the banking systems in each of these jurisdictions, so not just the G20 but the associated jurisdictions, becomes available to them because it will be seen as being compliant. And I think that's the carrot here.
Interesting. So basically the banks, the central banks, are the ones that are creating, in effect, the rules for DeFi. Do you think they're scared of DeFi stealing their customer base and seeing all their money flow into it?
No, particularly not.
You don't think there's any fear at all of that? Well, I mean, not now because it's really small. Yeah. But I mean, look, the IBM computer, the PC, was laughed at, right, by all the mainframe people at first, and it turned out that was the biggest threat on the planet to it. So I would, if I were one of those central banks, I would look at DeFi and be like, this is my personal baby Hitler. Like, when this thing grows, not now, but when it grows up, right, this is going to be a big deal. It's going to be a big threat. Right? I'm actually being serious, but yeah, I mean, that's how I would.
I know you are, but I think that the state of maturity for all of this is something that hasn't fundamentally put it on their. It's put it on their radar as something to consider, right? Something to entertain. You can see the work that's going on in CBDCs and all of that stuff as their own ways to be able to understand and interpret this. Whether they see this as a long-term, I mean, I think they saw Libra as an existential threat, right? Mm-hmm. Because Libra was a currency, right? And it was an international currency that they didn't have a look into. And I think that's why it got crushed. DeFi does not have that same quality to it. It has a quality of I think they're all really interested by it. But I think they all think that it's not particularly stable and it's not particularly mature. And so the amount of attention it's garnering is not great yet. What they need to do is they simply need to get the exchanges which are operating in this space to be as prudential as possible. And then I think that at least at this point, and again, this is me projecting onto it, they're not uncomfortable with nature taking its course. All right. I don't, and again, these things could develop very quickly. I mean, from our point of view, we saw DeFi come out of nowhere in about 6 months between, say, April and October of 2020, right?
Yep. DeFi summer. Yeah,
right.
Without
so
a doubt.
We know how fast it could happen.
Yeah, and it grew to about 200 billion at its peak.
Yeah,
in about a year. Like I don't know if anything else has ever done that. That's insane, right?
And trust me, when they are aware of this, right? That Heinrich, who's the head of the FSB, in his statement made some statements about the amount of money that was there, and when the amount of money that was totally involved in crypto was around $3 trillion. So at the peak of February or March this year, that was a large enough amount of money. Although actually most of that balloon has substantially deflated. Where are we at now? Like 400 billion, 500 billion now? It's not
it's below $1 trillion.
Yeah.
So, but not much below it, but we're below $1 trillion.
So they knew that amount of money actually wouldn't destabilize the global financial system if it suddenly went away, that amount of capital, but that it wouldn't be great. Right.
Right.
And so that's one reason why prudential regulation started to become something, because the numbers look like they could be getting large enough that prudential regulation would be a prudent thing for them to do.
Yeah, agreed. It could grow exponentially at any moment. That's the other thing. The speed with which these things could take off.
Not if you're listening to Kramer and selling all your crypto.
Yeah, well, that's Kramer. All right. Well, is there anything else I should have asked you here? We're coming up on the hour mark, so I just wanted to. And you've given us so much great stuff. This has been incredibly fascinating. And you're the man in the room, right? Yeah. The room where it happens, you're that guy. And it's very rare that any of us hear from someone like you, where we can, we can hear through your eyes, I guess, what they're thinking and what they sort of feel like. And I've actually heard a lot of very heartening things over the course of this conversation.
And again, this is not they are not out to get crypto. They are out to make sure that it doesn't hurt people to the degree that it's possible, particularly with investment, right? Like the next peak body that I suspect will come knocking on our doors, the International Organization of Securities Regulators, IOSCO. I forget what exactly it stands for, but it comes in a triplet, right? It's the FATF, the FSB, and IOSCO, and that may very well be when we start to think about not just sort of the financial stuff, but the securities aspects of stuff. So the investing and all of that other stuff. Maybe that fruit will fall from the tree in the next year or two, and there'll be a whole other set of questions. But all of this, again, the better that we can do this work, and the reason I'm quite happy and quite proud of this is because my goal is to make this the best possible world for everyone who's participating in these new tools, right? And if I can do whatever I can to help make them a little bit safer, that's a good day's work.
You're doing the Lord's work, my friend, and we all appreciate you. We very much appreciate you being in that room.
Yeah.
So thank you from all of us to you.
Yeah.
So, all right. Well, this has been Mark Pesce. Thank you once again. Extremely fascinating discussion. My name is Mark Jeffrey. This has been Hash Rate. We'll see you all next time.